pardon the euphemism, or no, it's not the euphemism, the bad joke. So we're delighted that you're here today, and we have an amazing program set up for you. You will be one of the first people in the United States to actually hear straight from one of the authors of this new landmark book about corruption in the West. And we also have two exceptional discussants who will enrich our discussion. So thank you, Laurence Cockcroft, Yana Morgan, and Christian Carl for coming today. I'd like to start by asking you a question. How many of you believe that corruption is a serious problem in the United States? Raise your hand. How many of you believe that corruption is a serious problem in Europe? Raise your hand. Okay. Oh, well, then you might be curious or wondering, then how come it is the case that if we look at the Transparency Corruption Perceptions Index, that none of these countries are actually at the bottom of the ranking? So I think by the end of our session today, you'll have a better understanding of why that is the case. But if I can just give you a hint, the Corruption Perceptions Index actually ranks countries on perceptions of public sector corruption, but nothing else. But I think you will find illuminating today that there is a lot more to corruption than just public sector corruption, even though that is a large part of it. So thank you very much again for coming. I would like to turn the floor over to Laurence Cockcroft in a moment. I'll just mention that biographies of all of us here at the table are in the back, and more importantly, flyers about how to obtain a copy of Laurence's book are also at the back on the table, so please do take a copy, and please do invest in a copy of the book, because I think you will find it illuminating. It is comprehensive, it is thoroughly researched, and yet it is written in a way that is accessible not only to policymakers and scholars, but also to lay people. And so it's really a valuable tool. I'd also like to thank the gentleman who's walking up towards us with a camera, Timo, Hvala, who is a visiting fellow here at CTR. He has put in an extraordinary effort to make our event possible today. Thank you, Timo. Laurence, I will just mention to our guests that not only is Laurence the author of Unmasked, Corruption in the West, but he is also the author of two other books, most recently Global Corruption, Money, Power, and Ethics in the Modern World. He is one of the founders of Transparency International, and he also then was the chair for several years of the chapter in the UK, Transparency International UK. I will let you read about all of his accomplishments in the handout that we have, so that we have more time to actually listen to the wisdom and insights of Laurence. Thank you, Laurence.
Thank you very much. I'm going to transfer to this podium, not because I'm going to inflict you with rhetoric, but because sometimes it's a bit easier to say whatever it is one wants to have to say. So I'm very grateful to Shaska and SAIS for running this meeting, and very grateful to Christian and Yana for joining us. The book in question and effectively the origins of this particular meeting are in the work that I and others initiated in anti-corruption from the early 90s onwards. In my case, through Transparency International, but of course others have also been engaged in that work through the likes of Global Witness, Publish What You Pay, and several other institutions. I think it's fair to say that when, certainly in my case, but when those of us who were involved in initiating this kind of work began that work, we were still perceiving corruption as essentially an issue for the developing world. And we spent a lot of effort in trying to get organizations like the World Bank engaged in combating corruption in their projects. and we spent a lot of time trying to get countries in Europe in particular to follow the tenets of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but mainly in relation to the work of those companies in the developing world. I think over the last 25 years, I and others have come to see corruption globally as much more of a spectrum. So there are kinds of corruption that prevail in countries like Bangladesh, Tanzania, Mexico, and so on. And there are kinds of corruption that prevail in the developed world, in what I might loosely call our societies, by which I mean societies of the West. So in my particular case, having written a book about global corruption, trying to understand that more fully, particularly in relation to the developing and ex-Soviet world, 4 years ago, I and my co-author, Anne-Christine Wegener, decided we would like to try and write a book about corruption in the North. So that's the rationale for the book, and in more or less, I can say the rationale for this particular meeting. When we talk about corruption in the North, and it's very interesting to see how many of you raised your hands now, if I might say so, because I think 5 years ago, and certainly 10 years ago, I'd say even 5 years ago, I'd be very surprised if that had been the case, because most of us have generally considered our own societies to have a few bad eggs, a few issues of corruption, certainly historically, but not really very seriously at the present time. However, that attitude, which might be defined as a rather elite attitude, is belied by a variety of public opinion surveys. So, for example, the Pew survey in the US and TI's own survey of opinion, Global Corruption Barometer in the variety of countries, but including all members of the EU, find together extraordinary convergence on a figure of 70%, that 70% of the public in both the EU and the US regard political parties and parliaments or national assemblies as corrupt. So this is a rather extraordinary figure, and it's a figure that has been prevalent for a number of years, but it's one which has taken a long time to come on board. And I think it's fair to say in the election here last year, it exploded, not only with what the now President Trump had to say about draining the swamp, but also from a different perspective, what Bernie Sanders was saying from his perspective, so that the idea of corruption became much more prevalent and something in the public domain. In Europe, it's a rather different story, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But there's no doubt that the rise of populist parties in Europe have been influenced by concepts of corruption that I intend to say a little bit more about. So in many ways, the purpose of the book, and what I'm going to summarize very briefly now, is what does this really mean? So what is this corruption that is perceived by the public, but is extremely difficult to define and doesn't show up in, as Shazka has shown, in indices like TI's own Corruption Perception Index. So we looked across the spectrum, first of all, at political finance. And if we take the issue of political finance in this country, we know, and I would imagine that most of you in the room would agree, that the Citizen United decision of the Supreme Court in 2010 established a rather different criteria and context for political finance by taking the lid off corporate finance and enabling very large amounts of money to flow into PACs and super PACs, so that in the 2011 to 12 congressional and presidential cycle, about a third of funds were raised from private donors, individuals, 30,000 individuals, and of the total expenditure of 6.2 billion in that election cycle, a very large proportion of those sums came from the corporate sector. And I would say that it's fair to say that this represents a phrase that I'm going to borrow from Professor Larry Lessig. This represents or leads to the corruption of influence, in which those funders who are putting up funds on that scale expect to have a particular outcome, if not at the presidential level, then at least at the congressional level. So is this reflected in Europe? Not exactly, because all European countries, all members of the EU except Sweden, have quite tight rules on electoral expenditure, both in the amount of money that can be raised and in the amount of money that can be spent. But what we do have is an extraordinary capacity to break the rules. So whether we look at Italy, not only under Berlusconi, but before Berlusconi, and indeed subsequent to Berlusconi, or we look at Spain, where the People's Party that is still in power has been exposed as having very large funds held offshore in Switzerland, which benefited not just the party, but individuals. Or whether we look at France, where Sarkozy succeeded in getting a 50 million euro grant from Colonel Gaddafi before he died to support Sarkozy's political party, and at the same time managed to get actually brown bags full of euros from Lillian Bettencourt, the then owner of L'Oréal perfume company. So we know that these rules are constantly being broken, but the influence, therefore, of those who break it is they're only going to do this either for personal benefit or for the benefit of their party rather than for the benefit of the public good. So everywhere campaign finance is an issue. There's certainly been various related issues in the UK, but I'm not going to go into that right now. So I think we can safely say that campaign finance and political finance more broadly is an issue which has persuaded the public that politics is rather devious and that dark money is very much a factor in that. But maybe the issue of lobbying is more important than campaign finance. And I would say here that the links between the lobbying industry and the raising of political finance is a very, well, first of all, is very close, as I'm sure everybody in the room knows, and secondly, leads to particular outcomes. So if a lobbyist is engaged in raising money for a member of Congress, that lobbyist expects to see a particular outcome in relation to the money that is raised. And the estimates by people like Professor James Thurber at American University are that congressmen spend half their time raising money, and that is actively assisted by lobbyists. So how does this work out in Brussels? So there are in Washington 13,000 registered lobbyists, and in Brussels there are 11,500. For a long time, that group in Brussels has not really been well defined, but in the last 2 or 3 years, the situation has improved, not least by pressure from civil society, including Transparency International, so that now there is a so-called transparency register in Brussels, and all lobbyists have to register on that, and they have to report any access they have to members of the Commission. But what does this really mean in practice? The way in which EU policy is really shaped is through so-called expert committees in the case of the Commission, and so-called public consultation committees in the case of the Parliament. And the membership of both those types of organizations is 3/4 corporate. So that decisions are taken in a very influenced in an extremely strong way by the corporate sector. And civil society, or a more broader representation of public views, is certainly secondary in all of that process. This is being increasingly exposed, for want of a better word, and questions are being asked about it, but it is a reality. And as a matter of fact, in the book, we go into examples of how that really works. So I would say lobbying both in Europe, the lobbying industry both in Europe and here, is a serious issue. Nobody's quite dealt with it satisfactorily because lobbying in itself is not objectionable. But the way it pans out means that the influence, particularly of the corporate sector, rather than a broader public interest, is certainly sustained. Then I want to say something about multinationals. We all tend to think of multinationals, first of all, as very positive in terms of economic output, and we tend to think of the negative aspect of multinationals, at least many of us in this room, as essentially being issues to do with oil and gas revenue or the activities of multinationals in the developing world. But actually, once you really look into it quite carefully, you can see that, for instance, in the pharmaceutical industry, all kinds of not only price fixing, but also bribing of doctors in order to take a particular drug, the mis-selling of particular drugs because in terms of what their capacity really is, and other examples of that kind, place the pharmaceutical industry in particular in a very difficult position. The defense industry is a very interesting case. I have personally been involved in a lot of work on corruption in the defense industry through TI, but not all those sales are in the developing world. So there is a classic case involving sales by Thyssen of submarines to Greece worth $3 billion in 2012, which led to a $200 million bribe to the then Minister of Defense in Greece. But this sum of $3 billion was then added to Greece's external debt and has formed a part, but not much discussed part, of Greece's external debt problems. So we can see that's an issue. And I won't expand very much because I think everybody here must be aware of the details. But if we look at the example of Volkswagen and the phony testing or the deceptive testing of diesel emissions, we can see that the way in which regulations are subverted in some cases by multinational companies is very serious. Volkswagen shares are 25% owned by the state of Saxony, so it's not as if this is a purely private enterprise. And we know now, because of a lot of coverage subsequent to the VW case, that a number of other automobile companies have been engaged in similar practices. So I think we can safely say that the way in which multinationals operate within Europe and the US is itself sometimes can be characterized as corrupt. I want to say something about banking and finance without overrunning my share of the time. The banking and finance crisis of 2007 to 8 has been ruminated over, analysed and dissected many times over, and I'm sure most of us here have read several accounts of it. I've tried to read as many as possible, but there are very, very few accounts that are prepared to regard that crisis as the subject and having been triggered by corruption. But we make the case in the book that actually it can be characterized and should be characterized as a corrupt process. Because whether we're looking at the ways in which subprime mortgages were sold with a great deal of pressure on people who couldn't afford it to take those mortgages, or the way in which they were bundled up and securitized and sold on without the buyer necessarily knowing what the contents really were, or whether or not we look at the way in which the credit agencies assess the securitized packages, giving them initially AAA ratings, or whether we look at the way the regulators operated, because regulators in this country are actually paid by the people who are being regulated. So that establishes a rather dubious relationship. And then if we look at the processes at the very top level in government, in the US Treasury and elsewhere in government, we can see that the role of Wall Street practitioners was extremely strong and in fact dominated the thinking on the regulation of derivatives during the later part of the Clinton administration in ways which I think even President Clinton has said that he now very much regrets. You may well argue that that wasn't a form of corruption, but actually if you really examine the consequences of that, it certainly did lead to forms of corruption. But we can debate that if you would like to do so. And then I would think as part of that, we need to note that the revolving door was crucial, because just as in the current administration, we have 5 key people from Goldman Sachs who are now in very influential positions in government. So then was the case with individuals moving actually from the same company to positions in Washington which influenced the outcome. I would say that whole process was also influenced by the apogee of neoliberal economics, in which it was argued that regulation was unnecessary because markets would solve the problem. And that was certainly the view of people as eminent as Alan Greenspan. But anyway, I think that what we need to take on board is that this combination of the mechanics of the sale of subprime mortgages, the way in which securitization happened, the way in which rating agencies rated those products, the way in which the regulators were effectively bought off, and the background in neoliberal thinking, which in itself was obviously not corrupt because that was a bona fide economic assessment at the time. But the outcome has certainly led to a process in which the banks can be described as having behaved corruptly. And if you rather doubt that, and if you look at the minutiae of cases which have been introduced in the courts here and in Europe over the last 3 years, the total volume of fines now paid by the end of 2016 is 350 billion. So that really is a very large sum, and you might say the banks should have been fined on that scale. But I think it's a case where the courts finally caught up with something that the public thought quite a long time ago was something that was a corrupt process. So I can't move away from issues of banking without saying something about offshore, because although we tend to think of offshore issues, by which I mean, for example, the UK dependencies in the Caribbean, like the British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos, and so on, and indeed the Channel Islands. We also need to think on the continent of places like Monaco and Liechtenstein. And we need to think here in the US of states like Delaware, Wyoming, and Colorado, where it's extremely easy to set up anonymous companies without beneficial ownership being recognized and listed. And of course, those vehicles, however you look at it, are the recipient of huge amounts of corrupt money from different sources, both from kleptocrats who are running countries, from organized criminal gangs, and indeed from complicated, distorted pricing of products, where individual companies are able to misprice a product, move their income from a given country to an offshore haven, and then hold it there for a certain period of time. So again, this might be described, and one might describe that as a legalized corruption. But the fact of the matter is that the presence of offshore centers, which account for about a flow of at least $1 trillion a year, is a huge incentive to corruption, because it means you can get away with it. Progress was being made under the last administration, but more importantly through the G7 generally. But there's a great danger now of that being set back. So in the book, we also talk about justice systems and look at the way in which justice systems operate. Are justice systems themselves, in some cases, corrupt, not only in countries like Bulgaria and Romania, who were brought into the EU in 2007 and signed up to a very complicated package of legislative reform, which was designed to deal with inter alia corruption, who have certainly fallen back from that. But we also explore the issue in the US of the election of judges at state level and what that has meant and whether or not it's true. And I know that it's very contentious, whether or not the fact that in 38 states judges have to raise money for their own campaigns to get re-elected leads to outcomes which may or may not be fully just. And so that's a question in itself. We also look at the question of organized crime. And organized crime seldom flourishes in any society without some kind of political buy-in. So organized crime is a really big issue. It's difficult to grasp. And I would say that's why it tends to be underrated as a question. And it doesn't matter whether we're looking, however, it doesn't matter whether we're looking at organized crime of a classic kind that we all know about, like Cosa Nostra, based in Sicily and other parts of Italy, and eventually in New York State, or whether we're looking at much more subtle forms now of cybercrime on the dark web, which is very impenetrable. But this certainly now impacts on people's lives. And if you look at the role of counterfeit medicines, which are ordered through the web and arrive in countries in small paper bags, individualized, then you can see that actually the way in which organized crime is dealing with new mechanisms like as the cyber systems, and indeed inventing new areas to work in, is constantly changing. So what's the scale of this? In Germany, last year, the German authorities reported that they had conducted 500 investigations into organized crime and established the fact that there were 100 different nationalities in Germany working on the organized crime system. So that's a big issue. And if you feel that this is more of a European issue than a North American issue, I'd like to just mention that in Canada, the Charbonneau Commission that reported about a year ago, so named because of its chairman, Judge Charbonneau, reported on a racket that had been going on for many years in the construction sector in Montreal and Quebec, in which a particular mafia group had got control of the allocation of contracts in the construction sector, had manipulated those contracts, had paid political parties off as a result of that, and had controlled their position through the use of violence of one kind and another. So this is a very extraordinary example of the way in which mafia-type organizations operate in the construction sector in a country which actually generally has been in TI's top 3 or 4 least corrupt countries, i.e. Canada. And if you're wondering what the origin of that is, as a matter of interest, the mafia group concerned all came from a town in western Sicily called Eraclea. So this has been a constant pattern over time, but one in which the move of that particular group to North America hadn't really changed. Then I want to say something briefly about sport, and I think we can all agree that it's a tragedy that during the last 5 years we've seen so much exposed in corruption in sport. And I have no intention of running through the list of cases that I'm sure most people here have read about from FIFA onwards and downwards. But it's a remarkable fact that, for example, in tennis, we now know that there's been serious match fixing over a period of time, not necessarily amongst the top 10 or so players, but 30 or 40 down the ladder. And it's difficult to explain the way in which the dynamics of this operate. But I just leave you with two thoughts in terms of what are the drivers of corruption in sport. One is offshore betting, and betting syndicates in Singapore are responsible for a great deal of match fixing in Europe. So believe it or not, about 3 years ago, Europol and the German police established the fact that about 300 matches in the Champions League in Europe had been fixed in response to offshore betting from Singapore. That seems almost unbelievable, but that is the official report from Europol, and I'm sure they didn't issue that gladly, but that nonetheless is the case. So one issue in terms of corruption in sport is the whole role of offshore betting. And the second issue, which I think it's important to recognize, is the way in which TV rights are sold, because a good deal of the problems that were unearthed in FIFA, particularly by the Attorney General for New Jersey, is that the TV rights in various cases that FIFA was allocating were sold to shell companies effectively owned by one or other board member of FIFA that were then sold on to others in the TV industry who were then paying a very high price for that. So in that way, individual people very close to FIFA were able to benefit from this system. So I think we need to recognize that the drivers in corruption in sport are very serious and quite complex and in fact structural. The last issue I'll say anything about is in relation to the environment, because we certainly argue in the book that not only is environmental destruction sometimes driven by corruption, but also the mitigation strategies that are developed are themselves also subject to various forms of corruption. So what do we really mean by that? In the case of the way in which corruption impacts on the environment, we can look at all kinds of ways in which effluent is piled into rivers in this country and in Europe, and very inadequately, those responsible for that are very inadequately punished, and in fact, largely because they've succeeded in subverting the regulating authorities. And in this country, there are some well-documented cases involving Coke industries in which that's clearly the case, but there are similar issues in Czech Republic and in Romania and elsewhere in Europe. And on the mitigation side, there's a lot of money involved in mitigating climate change, which is admirable, and I, for one, are a very strong supporter of. But there's also a lot of corruption in that process. So only about 2 years ago in Sicily, which was the recipient of about €1 billion to construct wind turbines, it turned out the construction of those turbines was completely dominated by one individual type who might be described as a mafia type, but the fact of the matter is that he controlled the construction of those wind turbines, which are very numerous, enumerating several hundred, and eventually was caught and the issue has been exposed. Theoretically, the money is supposed to be repaid, but we still don't know what's going to happen about that. So, and I'm not going to kind of recycle the VW issue, but one can see very clearly that the way in which companies can get away with subverting regulation, as in the diesel case, is very clear. So that's the spectrum that we're dealing with in the book. Now, I just want to say about, I never like to finish on too much of a negative note, so I'd just say a couple of things in relation to the significance of this. I think that there has been quite a lot of progress in the last 25 years in addressing corruption, not only in terms of international bribery, but also in terms steps that are now beginning to mature in terms of money laundering and in terms of the way in which multinationals behave more generally, and even the way in which heads of state are much more cautious than they would have been some years ago in amassing personal fortunes. So that progress, I would argue, is now in serious jeopardy as a result of the threats which occur both in Europe and here from possible changes in the way in which these advances may be undermined. So if we take an example like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which President Trump has described as a horrible act, or whether we look at the way in which the Dodd-Frank legislation has already Clause 1504, which deals with project-by-project reporting, has already been repealed by Congress. These are kind of lodestars which the rest of the world observes much more carefully than people may realize. And so I would say that there is a serious danger that if things are moved backwards in that respect, and you can be certain that whatever happens here will be mirrored by what happens in Europe sooner or later, then we shall see that a lot of the advances that have been made are rolled back. I would just add, however, in relation to the issues I've at least identified, if not discussed very thoroughly, in relation to Europe and America, then we need to be constantly vigilant. And the way in which civil society monitors all this and the response that civil society makes to it is very important. If the issues are regarded as a completely elitist issue involving only the corporate sector or of concern only to lawyers, then we won't make much progress. And in fact, for the reason I've just given, we may move backwards. So we are at a turning point, and I think it's a very important moment that we need to think about very carefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence. I will now turn to our two discussants, and after they share their thoughts about Laurence and on Christine Wegener's book, then we'll open the floor to questions, comments, thoughts from all of you. But I think one thing that Laurence really made clear is that corruption is not only about bribery. Corruption is about power and influence and how power and influence is used. And you shared the expression that comes from Lawrence Lessig, and yesterday you expanded upon that phrase with me when we met, and I just want to share that thought that Laurence had yesterday, where he said, corruption is also about the buying of influence and the selling of power. And I think that describes a lot of what he has been talking about. So next, I'm going to turn to Yana Morgan. And Yana is the director of Publish What You Pay USA. And she leads the coalition's efforts to bring transparency and accountability in the oil, gas, and mining sector. You can read all about her work in the flyer that's on the table in the back. Yana, thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Shazka. And thanks, Laurence, for your very interesting remarks. I have been able to read this book, and I think it is really great and well-researched, as Shazka mentioned, so definitely recommend for folks to pick it up and give it a read. Again, my name is Yana Morgan, and I'm the director of Publish What You Pay United States, and I'm grateful to be here because I have a story to tell. And it relates directly to some of the very important themes in Laurence's book and represents some of the biggest challenges facing our political system. And those include the revolving door between the private sector and government, the buying and selling of influence and power, and the very long reach of lobbyists into the government. So to give you a little bit of background, my organization is Publish What You Pay United States, and we're a part of a global civil society coalition focused on creating a more open and accountable extractive sector. Worldwide, we have partners in 60 different countries, and we have over 800 members. And in the United States, we have a 39-member strong coalition, and these groups range from Human Rights Watch to Amnesty International to Oxfam America, Global Witness, the Presbyterian Church, Catholic Relief Services, and a host of others. And so one of the most important moments in this transparency movement for Publish What You Pay, both in the US and abroad, was when we worked to pass a groundbreaking bipartisan anti-corruption law in 2010 called the Carden-Luger provision. And this was part of the Dodd-Frank Act and is also known as Section 1504. So the Carden-Luger provision was originally standalone legislation that was co-sponsored by Democratic Senator Ben Cardin and then Republican Senator from Indiana, Richard Lugar. And so it's the very, you could hold it up as a very, an excellent example of bipartisan work to combat corruption reaching across the aisle, and it had a lot of support from either side. Section 1504 requires oil, gas, and mining companies to publicly disclose what they pay for access to natural resources by project and for every country in which they operate, including companies abroad and countries in the United States. And the reason that this was an important provision is because too often countries rich in natural resources fall prey to what is known as the resource curse. And this is a paradoxical scenario in which countries rich in natural resources are actually some of the poorest due to corruption and mismanagement of those natural resources. Sometimes corrupt activities by the government, sometimes by companies, or sometimes they're doing it in conjunction with each other. And so this regulation would not only have shone a light on corrupt payments and would have empowered citizens to hold governments accountable, it would have given investors the opportunity to assess and mitigate the risks of their investment in some of these resource-rich countries. And it also plays a crucial role in U.S. national and energy security by preventing some of the conditions like insecurity and poverty that allow terrorist groups and criminal networks to form. You can essentially combat some of these really difficult issues. And we know that groups such as ISIS, for example, have used oil revenues to fund their operations. And this legislation could also make it difficult for large sums of money to be funneled to these groups because we'll have a way to actually follow that money. Apparently, Schoolhouse Rock lied to us all when it told us the seemingly simple way a bill becomes a law. It actually wasn't like that. Once the law was passed in 2010, then the SEC had to write the regulations, which means we entered into a very complex rulemaking process that took over 2 years. And then finally, in 2012, we had the regulations. So wonderful regulations. Everyone was very excited. It really was groundbreaking and set the stage for the development of an international standard. But then the American Petroleum Institute, which is the lobbying arm of Big Oil, sued the SEC along with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and then the law was sent back to the SEC the regulation rather, was sent back to the SEC to be revised. Fast forward again, we have a second rulemaking. It takes nearly 3 years this time for the SEC to come out with a new regulation. And this was a long process in which every stakeholder had the opportunity to weigh in, from the extractives companies to industry associations to investors, civil society, academics, and any other stakeholder that wished to. It was a very public process. So while it was already an uphill battle to get strong transparency regulations, even in the Obama administration, and as lobbyists were, continuing to become very influential, we did get a major win in 2016 when the regulation came out in June. While there were some concessions made to industry, it was actually still quite a strong rule, and so in that instance, facts did win the day. But I should note that while this was going on, in 30 countries around the world, they were following our lead and had passed laws similar to Section 1504. So despite the U.S. delays, there are laws still and now being implemented in the European Union, Norway, and Canada. So there was a shift towards greater transparency globally, and so that was a major part of the success. So in June, we were all feeling pretty good as a coalition. We had a great regulation on the books. It would take a little while for the reporting to begin, but we were ready to wait. And despite serious opposition by the oil and gas sector, we had won the day. So we readied ourselves to move on. Then, of course, the elections happened, and everybody's plans kind of went out the window. People began to talk about this little-known law called the Congressional Review Act. Have people here heard of the Congressional Review Act? Yes. I guess it was a couple of people. So the Congressional Review Act is a law that allows Congress 60 legislative days to analyze any regulation that's been put out by a government agency, and they can assess it, and they can potentially vote and vote to repeal it if they don't think it's fit for purpose. And it was meant to go after what they like to call midnight regulations, so regulations that were an initiative of an agency that were put forward, some might think hastily, or that weren't well thought out, didn't have a strong stakeholder outreach, and so it was supposed to have a very specific remit. But I should also note that the CRA offers no filibuster opportunity, and that in order to pass a CRA resolution, it only requires a majority vote. So there's no 60 a need for 60 votes in this instance. And it's a very blunt instrument in that once a regulation is repealed using the Congressional Review Act, the agency usually is very hesitant to release another regulation, although it's really only been used once because it's such a blunt instrument. But the regulation that an agency does in the future release cannot be substantially the same as the regulation that had previously come out. And so many in Congress had their eye on using the CRA to undo a number of Obama-era regulations. And so in January, a regulatory putsch began, and Congress wielded the undemocratic and dangerous weapon known as the Congressional Review Act. So the Carden-Lugar provision, Section 1504, again, was a bipartisan anti-corruption law. Seems like a no-brainer that everyone would want to support such an initiative. Suddenly became public enemy number one. So why is that? And the answer begins to touch on some of the themes raised in Laurence's book. So there are many reasons: the influence of money in politics and the revolving door of government and the private sector being of primary importance here. So as the Congressional Review Act was kind of simmering on the Hill, Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, was being considered for Secretary of State. So here's some important background. ExxonMobil has been an enemy to transparency and anti-corruption efforts of the kind that we work on since we were founded, and especially to the Carden-Lugar provision. In fact, before the law was passed in 2010, Rex Tillerson personally lobbied then-Senator Richard Lugar against the law, noting that it would hurt ExxonMobil's business relationship with Russia. So as has been well documented, ExxonMobil and Rex Tillerson have close relationships with Russia, and the recent request by Exxon for exemptions from sanctions against the Russian government further illustrates that. So it was very interesting for us, to say the least, that the day Tillerson was confirmed was the same day that the House voted to repeal this regulatory safeguard, some 6 days into the presidency. So the vote was nearly along party lines, with a few breaking with party, and I want to name them here because we're quite proud of them and for supporting the right thing, and that would be Representatives Royce, Smith, Fitzpatrick, and Jones. Then, a few days later, the regulation was executed at dawn during a 6:30 a.m. vote in the Senate. So it seems like they didn't want the public to be able to watch as they cast their votes in favor of corruption, again, down party lines. This was the first regulation that was repealed using the Congressional Review Act, a bipartisan, thoroughly vetted anti-corruption safeguard meant to create a more transparent oil and gas sector, empower citizens to demand accountability from their governments and companies, and to give investors much-needed data. So before these votes happened, our coalition met with dozens of congressional offices, the majority of which were Republicans. Constituents sent over 21,000 letters to their members, and over 6,000 phone calls were made. There were also numerous articles, blogs, op-eds, letters to the editor, and think pieces put out, even by conservative think tanks, advising members of Congress to not repeal this important regulation. So the question kind of was for us, why was this a congressional priority? This generally well-respected, well-supported, it had company support, it had investor support, civil society. Why was this a congressional priority and the first thing that they went after? And the likely answer is very simple. We went to the Hill armed with facts and the oil and gas sector went armed with money. Lobbying money, campaign contributions, and other kinds of financing. And in our discussion with offices, it became very clear that some members actually didn't even know what they were voting for and were rather relying on the voice of industry and the voice of leadership. So we do know that at some point ahead of this vote, there was a cracking of the whip by Republican leadership for the soldiers to fall in line on this particular vote, and they did, especially with this being the first Congressional Review Act vote, the very first kind of big act of Congress of the year. It was important for them to show unity, and even more important, for them to build up the war chest for 2018. And then on Valentine's Day, Donald Trump signed the repeal of the 1504 regs, and it became official. So chocolate didn't really make us feel any better on that day, unfortunately. I should note that the actual law is still on the books, and the CRA does require that the SEC produce another regulation within a year, but they will be doing so with drastically different leadership at the SEC. So while we were the first sacrifice on the altar of big oil, we were certainly not the last. Congress also repealed laws preventing coal companies from dumping waste into streams. They repealed a land planning rule that would have given American citizens the opportunity to weigh in on how public lands were used. Bills were introduced to repeal regulations protecting wildlife refuges from irresponsible drilling, and another was introduced to repeal a regulation that improved safety and prevented oil spills in the Arctic. So today is actually the last day to vote on any of these CRAs. So fingers crossed that these other regs remain intact. In addition to the three that I've mentioned, Section 1504 and the other two, there were, I believe, 11 other regulations that were repealed as of now. The administration has also given the green light to both the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone Pipeline. So this is an excellent illustration of the power of deep-pocketed lobbyists. And there's a great quote or a statistic in the book that comes from the Sunlight Foundation that I want to say for everyone here. Between 2007 and 2012, the top 200 most politically active corporations spent $5.8 billion on lobbying, which earned them $4.4 trillion in returns. So that's a pretty great return on investment for the lobbyists. So with this current administration, there are definitely some significant challenges to civil society. We're in a post-facts world, which is a term I actually hate, but everyone is using it, so I guess I'll do it too, where the best policy arguments may not always win the day. We are living in a world where lobbyists, corporations, and the very wealthy seem to have more influence than ever before, and this is really a kind of legalized corruption, as we've been talking about. So civil society is going to need to change up their tactics, and I don't purport to have all of the answers, but I think one thing that we can do as civil society is to look for new opportunities to partner with other groups, whether it be with progressive companies, faith-based groups, investors, or thought leaders, and trying to get them to join us to work in coalition as we move forward with our work ahead. And we also need to continue in our role as watchdogs, more importantly than ever before, and to make sure that the information we're putting out is accessible to the public, because one benefit of everything that's gone on over the past few months is that we do have a much more engaged, active, and vocal electorate. So to conclude, one thing that has become very clear is that the impacts and influence of money in politics are alive and well, and the increasing role it plays in determining government policy should both worry but also motivate us all. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jana.
Thanks.
We'll turn to Christian Carl now, and I'll just mention that Christian is the editor of the Global Opinions section in the Washington Post.
No, that's not quite right.
Okay, I'm sorry. Please
So
correct
I'm
me.
the editor of Democracy Post, which is
Okay.
part of that section, I guess you could say.
Okay,
But I'm not the editor of Global Opinions. That's
okay.
awfully sorry.
Thanks for the correction. And you can read the partially accurate, unfortunately, the partially accurate bio of Christian on our handout, and I apologize for the errors.
No, not at all.
But Christian, I know you're going to add another dimension to this discussion, and I know that corruption is something that is not only a problem for citizens and a problem for our economies and our environment, but also a problem for democracy. And so I'm hoping that Christian will touch on that too. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm sure that was an amazing presentation that you made. I'm sure my remarks will not stand up in comparison. I have just a few general remarks to make. I too am a big fan of this book. I found it very, very powerful, just the sheer documentary force of tracking all of these examples and bringing them home to us. I found the detail really fascinating and convincing. As I was reading the book, several questions came to mind. Above all, I remembered when I was living in Russia in the late 1990s as a journalist, and the Clinton administration kept telling us that Russia was this fantastic democratic success. They kept repeating that over and over again, and Russians heard that. And they kept saying, so this is democracy? The Americans tell us this is democracy? And the reasons why the Russians were a bit nonplussed to hear that was, I think, if we want to dramatically oversimplify, the word corruption. Because yes, they had democracy, they had elected representatives making laws in the Duma, they voted for their president in 1996, voted for Boris Yeltsin, and all of them had stories to tell about their own experiences with the nepotism of the administration, petty corruption, grand corruption. Yeltsin, of course, made a deal with the leading already oligarchs of the country at that time to sell off shares in state-owned companies for song in return for, some money to the Russian budget, the famous loans for shares deal, and all Russians knew about it. Basically, 7 men ended up owning the Russian economy. And the entire time, the Clinton administration was telling Russians, be thankful you've got democracy now. So that's how we ended up with Putin and the situation we're in now. I kept thinking about that when I was reading the book. Why? First of all, because as Laurence has shown so eloquently, this issue of corruption is a vast and sensitive issue that we ignore to our peril because it has very distinct and immediate political impacts. People care about justice. In all cultures, this is one thing that comes through quite strongly, although they may formulate it differently, but especially in the great religious traditions, whether it be the Quran, the Bible, and Buddhism, there are very, very clear and distinct prohibitions about using, for example, public position for private gain. One thing that occurred to me as I was reading the book is, do these prohibitions still hold? Because even though we see these magnificent examples of people taking to the streets very recently in Poland, in Romania, and various places to protest government overreach and especially corruption. I'm leaving what's the most prominent? Romania, I think, is the most prominent recent anti-corruption protests, but there have been some others. Slovakia.
Yeah, and Macedonia has been.
And Macedonia, exactly. A lot of these big protests in Macedonia have also been fueled by the corruption issue. So it's clear it is a hot button issue for many citizens. Then came our election, okay? And I talked to a lot of Americans before the election, also outside of the Beltway bubble. And I have to say that I was deeply dispirited to hear what they thought about the conflicts of interest represented by potential Trump presidency. I don't know how any of you who are American citizens voted. I certainly don't mean to impugn your choice, but it was that particular issue that struck me. So what should Trump do if he becomes president? Should he put all of his assets into a blind trust? He hasn't published his taxes yet. Is that an issue for you? And again, what I heard from people was, How can you be so naive? Everyone in Washington is corrupt. You know? Are you trying to convince me that people in Washington aren't corrupt? No, what we need is somebody who will stand up for us, and the rest I don't care about. He's a big businessman, you know? Businessmen have to take shortcuts sometimes. Yeah, it comes with the territory. Have you ever met a businessman who doesn't pay the odd bribe, you know? But in return for that, we'll get a guy who stands up for our interests, whoever we may be. And I was really struck by how often I heard that, because it seemed to me that some really fundamental norms of American society have somehow shifted or been eroded. You know, a lot of these people I was talking to described themselves as evangelicals or Christians, and yet somehow the moral dimension of this really didn't seem to bother them at all. And I'm not accusing them of hypocrisy. I don't know I'm in a position to do that, but I was simply very struck by that. I grew up in West Texas among a lot of evangelicals, and so I'm quite familiar with the mindset. And when I was growing up, how many times have you heard that? When I was growing up, everything was great. But I remember people being actually quite rigid on things like that. They actually had quite a fixed moral standard, and they didn't tolerate deviations of any kind. So I have to say that I'm very, very struck by this. On the one hand, I see a growing kind of civic engagement, also in this country, as I think Yana represents so eloquently. But there is this other counter trend, and I don't think it's restricted to the United States. You see it in places like the Philippines, where I was recently, which is a country which is controlled by 20 or 30 families. And when people voted for Rodrigo Duterte, they voted, and this has gone largely unreported in the Western reporting on Duterte. Duterte talked a lot about anti-corruption. It was a very prominent part of his platform. And so he was promising people anti-corruption, and he promised them he would take down the oligarchs a notch, right? You can argue that Duterte is himself something of an oligarch. He is part of, you know, the privileged families of the Philippines, but that message rang true. It resonated with people. And you see that in a lot of these other places. Erdogan in Turkey, a lot of authoritarian leaders use that rhetoric even when they are themselves quite corrupt. And if they can make it make sense to people, people are willing for them to forgive them a lot. So I just throw that out there. I don't think any of this is particularly deep or detailed, but those were the thoughts that were going through my mind as I read the book. You mentioned Trump very briefly in a few places, but of course the book was written before he was elected.
True, I'm afraid.
Yes. So the book, of course, doesn't really address this head on, but I think it does point to this larger issue. As you said, we are at a turning point, and I think that is very, very true, and I'm very grateful to you for driving that point home in the book. So that's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Christian. So we're on schedule, and so we've got a good chunk of time to have some exchange with all of you. So I would ask people, if you have a comment or a question or an experience, to first identify yourself and then share what you'd like to say. Thank you. The gentleman in the back, and then the young man in the front.
Ken Meyercourt, retiree. Should we consider a former president receiving $500,000 for a speech an a priori case of corruption? And is the fact that sort of phenomenon, which we have seen, doesn't seem to cause a ripple in the American public, reflect the sort of change that you were speaking of?
I'll just reply very briefly to that, and obviously colleagues here may wish to say something in addition. We seem now to be in a world in which it's a norm for, as you say, retired heads of state or very senior politicians to receive large sums for a single speech. And as a British citizen, I'm sorry to say that's already true of David Cameron and George Osborne, who've received extraordinarily large sums by British standards for similar kinds of presentations. I don't have an answer to the question. It just seems to me there is an issue about whether or not the person in question then commits those funds to a charitable purpose. If they do, I personally find that more acceptable. I think it's difficult to argue that this is a contravention of a very narrow definition of corruption, and the one that we haven't talked about but I like to work with because it originates pretty much with TI, is that corruption is the misuse of entrusted power for personal gain. And I'm not quite sure that actually a speaking fee after you're retired from office represents a misuse of personal power, but of entrusted power. But it's a tricky but very hot area. So I think I personally would be very interested to see what Christian and Yana have to say.
Well, I just wanted to say, I think it's great you brought that up. I think he's actually come in for quite harsh treatment for that. I must have read 50 articles in the past week assailing him for that, and I was kind of, I have to say, I was kind of reassured by that. So for what it's worth. I mean, I'm not challenging your point in any way.
Talking about Clinton or Trump? I mean, Obama.
I was talking about Obama.
I was talking about Clinton.
Oh, okay. Well, I was thinking of Obama. That's so funny that you...
He should be complaining that he only got 400,000.
Yeah, well, there you go. How about that? Okay. Sorry, my mistake.
Jonna, did you want to add anything? No? Okay. The young man in the front.
Thank you. My name is Sergio Martinez, and I am a grad student at Catholic University of America. It's a pleasure, and thank you so much for these valuable insights and experiences in regards of corruption. Professor Laurence, I was interested to know more about what are your thoughts in the measurement approach on corruption across the US and Europe based on the 5 dimensions that you consider, like lobbying, political finance, environment. I ask you this because always when I think about strategies to address corruption, the starting point is to build reliable indicators and measures that allow policymakers, citizens to be in the same page on understanding the magnitude of the problem. And since we all know the limitations in regards to the Transparency International Index, so I'm wondering what would you say in that sense? Thank you.
Before responding, I'd just like to understand your question a bit more thoroughly. Can you just restate it in one sentence? What's the question?
What would you say about the measurement approach on corruption across the US and Europe to capture the dimensions that you mentioned in your book, the 5 dimensions on corruption?
Well, okay. I mean, that's a very interesting topic, and it has been an interesting topic for a long time in the world of anti-corruption. And obviously, you know, because you've referred to it, that TI began in 1997 to produce its own ranking of as many countries as possible. Now, about 150 countries are ranked annually in terms of that scale. But as I'm sure you also know, and I imagine other people in the room know, that indexing has always been extremely controversial because actually, as Shaska mentioned in her introductory remarks, it's more or less an assessment of whether or not the public sector is corrupt, especially in its interface with the private sector. And it has run into many criticisms, but in a way the most interesting one in relation, for example, to my country, the UK, is the following. That the UK generally does fairly well, I think number 8 or 9 of least corrupt countries, but actually, as is frequently pointed out by its critics, if we then factor in the British dependencies overseas, which includes the Caymans, British Virgin Islands, Guernsey, Jersey, etc., which are a series of secrecy jurisdictions, as I mentioned, quasi-secret, I should say, then we can see that actually the role of the UK is grossly inflated in the sense that it doesn't deserve to have the 8th or 9th position. So that's just an example of one of the weaknesses of the index. Having said that more generally, which I think is more pertinent these days to your remarks, I do worry because there is a whole industry that is engaged in measuring corruption in international institutions, including the World Bank, that produces the World Governance Index every year and so forth and so on. I just worry myself that it's so difficult to really capture the scale of corruption in any of our societies that it may not be worth the candle. So let me give you an example. If we look at the pillars of integrity, which is a phrase TI and others have used, if we look at the pillars of integrity in any given country, one of those is the justice system. So let's ask the question, how do you determine whether or not the justice system is corrupt? Well, I made a few remarks about that. But actually, in many cases, people would say the fact that I can't get a court hearing for 3 years itself constitutes a form of corruption, and I consider the justice system to be corrupt. So if you actually then add all the other rather subtle points people might make in other sectors, like the environment, then it becomes an extraordinarily complex, virtually algebraic exercise involving very sophisticated mathematics. So I'm skeptical, I'm just giving you a personal view, about the extent to which we can really measure corruption in a meaningful way. I'm not at all skeptical, as you can see from what I've been saying, about the impact of corruption. And I'm afraid I personally, but some colleagues would disagree, would fall back on the view that you know it when you see it. Sorry about that.
There's another index that Laurence alluded to, which is called the Financial Secrecy Index. And that is an index that ranks jurisdictions according to their secrecy and scale of their offshore financial activities. So that index, which is produced by the Tax Justice Network, is in that index actually the UK, together with its offshore, what would you call it? The offshore
Try dependencies.
dependents like Cayman Islands and British Virgin Islands and others, Jersey. The UK is at the top as the most secret, and then if you look at the others in the top 10, they're among the countries that are considered the, quote, least corrupt in the Transparency Corruption Perception Index. So Switzerland, Hong Kong, USA, Singapore, Germany. So it reverses very spectacularly. So again, what one looks at will determine what one is actually considering corrupt and which countries fall in these, again, very imprecise types of measurements. Yana, did you or Christian have anything that you wanted to add?
No, I mean, not too much, just that it's interesting to look at the different measures and how different kinds of corruption or transparency or perceptions of corruption, for example, are kind of measured. And I think it's important to consider some of the legalized forms of corruption that we might consider, not good behavior, but it technically isn't really corrupt. For example, companies or individuals using every tax break or loophole or law available to them to avoid paying taxes. Some may find that to be a prime example of corruption. Others may say, well, if they can do it, why not? The president said it himself. It made him smart to not pay any taxes. But would we say the same if we find out, for example, that major companies are using those loopholes and taking money and not paying their taxes, and they're doing so in a legalized way? So I think that's something important to be thinking about is, what are these legal circumstances that allow people to do things that are very shady but technically not going around the law?
I'll just add one thing before we turn. Now I see we've got a lot of people energized. But in all of the comments, there's been a very strong indirect reference to corruption in that it's not. It does not consist of singular transactions between two individuals. That the corruption that Laurence and Christine Wegener discuss in their book, the corruption that happens in the Global South even, consists of acts that are happening within a system. So corruption is functioning in a system. And this abuse of entrusted power, it's not only for private gain, as you've also heard. It's also for political gain, for collective gain, for example, for a political party, not for a particular individual. So when we understand corruption in that sense, I think we can get a better idea of how it operates in different parts of the world and how it's all linked, because corruption in one part of the world is linked to corruption in another part of the world. So let's turn back to you. I see, I'll start first with the lady here with the flowered sweater in the front, and then I'll move to the gentleman here, then to the lady in the back in blue, and then to the gentleman in the middle on this side of the room.
Hi, my name is Jordana Moran. I work in Washington. A couple of the comments that were made, and as well as this recent question on the measurement, makes me wonder. Christian, you talk about back in the day in West Texas, and maybe there's this issue of changing mores. How far back does measurement go of corruption? Is it possible that maybe our mores were never that great? And I mean, in the 1800s, the early 1900s, do we have any sense of what kinds of corruption were prevalent then in the West, and are they just as or more prevalent now? And in your research, do you have a sense of how popular culture, maybe this renewed interest in the Kardashians, and not to blame a single family, but just sort of pop culture, how does that affect our mores and our views of corruption?
Are we taking these one at a time? Or?
I think we've got 4 people, so I think we've captured everybody. So we'll take one at a time, and then I think we'll
Okay.
wrap up.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's always a very interesting question. And I think the way in which corruption changes over time is not necessarily something that, in spite of quite a lot of academic work, especially in recent years, we really understand. So there's no question, but of course, as your question implies, there's no doubt that in Europe and in this country, in the 19th century, corruption was rife, absolutely not the slightest doubt. And we know that from very good literature, like The Gilded Age, and like Democracy, a splendid book by John Adams about corruption in Washington in the 1860s. So, this is a known, and it's been written about. And I'm just going to throw this in for amusement value. A new exhibition has just opened in London about Charles Dickens as an investigative journalist on the issue of corruption. So if anybody's passing through London, check it out. Anyway, so, we know that this is the case. What I believe happened in most of European society here and elsewhere is that around the later part of the 19th century, people saw that actual political life, ethics, and government had got out of line, and that it was necessary to introduce various forms of legislation in order to try and deal with that. And I think here the first legislation of a really meaningful kind was in 1890s civil service reform in a big way, and it was certainly true that between 1880 and 1906 in the UK, a lot of legislation was introduced which made major changes. I think now what we're seeing is that maybe that legislation that was certainly active by the early 20th century has run out of steam and is frequently being subverted. And as this conversation shows, there's a lot we still have to do. But I do think it's possible, at least in the countries we're talking about today, Europe and the US, to see how that has evolved over time. And it's not very difficult to show that actually a lot that has been achieved is now also under threat.
Okay. The gentleman here on this side of the room.
Yes, Obrat Kasic, and I'm here local from Washington, D.C. 2 questions. The first is, are we becoming numb to corruption? Because first and foremost, because of technology with the internet and how easily and quickly we get news, because it seems that every time you open up, there's a story about corruption. And depending on what news source you read, it's targeted towards the other side for the most part. And in societies that are divided, and that's the second question, because most societies are divided, corruption just becomes another politicized theme that's used to score points. And so there's a focus on corruption when it serves a political interest. And media that line up, unfortunately, on one side or the other, tend to focus on it more when it's dealing with the opposing viewpoint. And I think that may be an answer to the dilemma that Mr. Carl had when he talked to people outside of Washington, D.C. and I grew up in the Rust Belt,
Yeah.
is that people just simply are tired of it because they do see that for what, let's say, the political classes, they see the hypocrisy. So we spend so much time looking at our navel in the sense of, is Trump going to become corrupt? But how much time do we spend in looking, and I say this as a Democrat, looking at what was happening with the Clinton Foundation?
Right.
And it's a dilemma. So, and it's a serious problem.
Well, yes, I mean, I think that's exactly what I was addressing in my own inarticulate way, was this point that people at this precise moment in American political history seem to be, this is a very subjective judgment, of course, but they do seem to be willing to overlook these things when they feel like it's, as you said, politicize them, right? There's no longer the sense of an overarching standard. You know, well, I'll overlook Trump because he's my guy, right? And, you know, a lot of Democrats said, you know, the foundation didn't matter at all. We don't even need to look at it, it just doesn't matter. You know, pox on the other side. So I think there is a certain numbing effect, and I think it does have to do with information. I think it also has to do with the complexity of today's society, which is a big factor in all of this, because, you know, try explaining beneficial ownership to my grandma. Mm-hmm. It's not so simple. It can be done, I think. I think you could probably do it. But, you know, the way that you can move money around today and how quickly and effortlessly you can do it, I think is a big technical problem for helping people to understand some of these issues. That doesn't mean it can't be done, but it just makes it harder.
Right. So this isn't necessarily my area of expertise, so I'm more focused on the oil and gas sector. But as an American citizen, I can certainly give my opinion there. Are people becoming numb to corruption? I think people were becoming numb, and then I think you had a Bernie Sanders and a Donald Trump come along, and it sort of stirred people up in different ways. And I think part of the reason people had become numb or become disenfranchised is because they don't think that they can have an influence.
Yes.
Which is really unfortunate, because they can.
Yes.
And they've found that they can by going out and voting. Unfortunately, half of America chose to remain apathetic at this particular time, or rather during the election. But I think some of those disenfranchised people thought they would have a voice in the people that they voted for, the people they voted for in the primaries, for example, and maybe are slowly coming to find out perhaps they don't. Maybe that will create a numbing effect again. Maybe it will make them want to become more involved or find out more information. One of the things that I think what we have seen in politics over the last couple of years is that, or at least one of the benefits of what has happened recently, is that people are much more engaged than they were previously. People are actually trying to know, for example, what the health care bill does, the new health care bill. Whereas a couple of years ago, no, they probably wouldn't have. But now people are getting more informed. So I think we did see a numbing, and then we saw a lot of anger, and the populism was the response to that. And what we're going to see now over the next couple of years, that, you know, I think that's a question yet to be answered.
We're going to turn to the woman in the back in a moment, but I would just add that the starting point within a society is at the bottom when you're going to fight corruption.
Yeah.
It's not when we're all at the top and ready to go. So we could see that we have hit the point where there is the potential now for a civic awakening in the U.S. This has happened in many countries around the world. This is like my personal area of research. Our discussion today is not about people power and people power movements and campaigns to combat corruption, but in fact, this is a very powerful source of change. And we do know that citizens are very much angered by their perceptions of corruption and real corruption in the U.S. So what happens next remains to be seen. Whether there will be a coming together of different parts of the society that are concerned and find ways to mobilize citizens, to give them a voice and give them different things to do beyond demonstrations in Washington will be critical. But I think I think the potential is there, and it's up to many of us who are concerned about it to find a way to actually harness those voices, no matter who they are, and it has nothing to do with political parties or political ideology. Thank you.
Thank you for that. My question is a little bit different from that. It's actually kind of a little bit more far-reaching. It's the privatization of our military intelligence communities, which occurred also during the Clinton administration. I'm a progressive Democrat, but that did start occurring during that administration. And anyway, it's I find that very discomforting, because these intelligence, when they privatized our intelligence communities, they also were able to charge our governments large amounts of money for contracts for training their employees, and they would perhaps charge our government 4 times the amount our government would use to train their government employees. And these private intelligence communities are given very high clearance levels. They are beholden to stockholders and not to us, the citizens. And they're all over. They can go just about anywhere in the world because they are private and they are beholden to their individual companies. They compete with one another. They are extremely wealthy because they've received billions of dollars from our military. And, well, unfortunately, they can cause damage throughout the world. And so there's a fellow who wrote quite about this. It was called Spies for Hire, and he discussed this. But it's
So maybe
what can the average citizen do about this, and what can we as a collective body do about these intelligence communities that can just, with no transparency, they can they're and beholden to their stockholders.
So in a way, it's 2 questions. The problem of these types of the privatization of something that's very serious, security issues, and then what can people do about it? Maybe, I don't know who.
Brother Christian.
Christian, I'll give you a moment to think about that, and then I will just ask the last gentleman to ask his question while you're formulating your answers to that important question, and then we will wrap up.
Just a very short question. The panelists did not discuss the food system as far as I could listen. And when you look at food, we talked a little bit of oil and gas, but when you look at food, you take 2 examples. One is sugar and the enormous lobbying and love, for example, against sugar taxes in this country and in Ecuador and in Mexico. I've heard the sugar lobbyists really go after the Mexican government, calling for, in Chile and Ecuador, just public statements against those governments, aggressively attacking them on their sugar taxes. And the same thing happened in cities when Philadelphia and a few other cities, San Francisco and Chicago, tried to pass or did pass some kind of a sugar tax. And the lobbying that goes on around sugar is extraordinary around the world. And the second one is on wheat. And I noticed that unlike the financial sector, very few, if any, went to jail in the 2008. But in wheat, the Australian government did put the chairman of the Australian Wheat Board in prison for his bribery of the Iraqi wheat importers. So again, there's no discussion on
Oil for food.
Oil and terrific, but not much on food.
2 very good questions. Thank you.
I just have a quick response to that. So again, I don't work in the sugar or wheat field, so I can't comment too much on that. But what I would say that I don't think has been brought up yet, but I think is raised in Unmasked, is that in the times where corruption or malfeasance is found out, if the penalty is just a slap on the wrist, for example, like you're bringing up, one actually went to jail in Australia versus in the U.S. where no one went to jail. If the consequences are worth the bad action, then they're going to take they're going to do the bad action. If paying a bribe is going to get you something way better than not paying a bribe and your penalty is a slap on the wrist, of course you're going to go ahead and do it. So in terms of actually combating corruption, one of the things that we need to think about is ensuring that our regulations have more than a slap on the wrist, that you actually have jail time, that some of these deferred prosecution agreements, maybe they get a little harsher. Maybe we don't do those. Maybe people who have been found out to be dealing in corrupt ways actually have to pay a price and go to jail rather than paying a fine that's easy for a large corporation to make. And again, that's something that is touched on in the book. And that doesn't completely answer your question, but it is something I wanted to put out there. And it makes a very important point about the need for real regulations and real penalties in order to combat these problems.
So to answer the lady's question, I'll do my best. So of course, the privatization of all sorts of American government services started, I would say probably, what would you say, Laurence, in the Reagan era, probably accelerated after that. And of course, it had to do with free market ideology that, there are some things that government doesn't need to do, that the private sector can do more efficiently. So there was, I think, a kind of logical rationale in the beginning for a lot of privatizations. And of course, under Thatcher, we had privatizations of big industries. There was this whole privatization wave in the 1990s. But I think your example is actually a very good one of how privatization actually can conjure up a lot of problems in its own right. And my earlier point about the complexity of modern society feeds into this too, because I think that whole process happened largely out of sight of the American public until really the Iraq War, we began to realize how many of these private contractors were around. And it is a process we have now seen which actually does have a very strong element of corruption, because these companies are part of the revolving door. A guy goes from being a general in the Pentagon to opening his own security company. He knows how to get contracts, cost plus, there are all kinds of ways you can ding the system. And then you start hearing these stories, which I heard all the time when I was covering the war in Iraq, of, this guy is in the special forces, he's risking his life every day, and he gets $25,000 a year. And that guy over there is a contractor who sits in a comfortable hooch and, doesn't do much all day, but he gets $200,000 a year, for analyzing intelligence reports or something. And people often commented on that disparity and wondered why these private sector salaries some of these people were getting were so extreme. And I think we are now seeing a backlash against all of this. And interestingly, your question about spies for hire feeds into it, because, of course, some of the biggest, depending on your viewpoint, revelations and or scandals we've had come from people like Edward Snowden, who was a private contractor in the intelligence industry. And I think, unless I deceive myself, now that people have become a bit more aware of these things, I think we may actually see something of a backlash against the privatization of security. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I kind of expected it to happen earlier, see more of it by now, but we haven't. So, but I think that actually is very pertinent to the subject at hand, because the relationships between those private contractors and the extremely secretive security establishment, they become very, very hard to keep track of and police and to put under the view of regulators who can make sure that everything is happening the way it's supposed to. So we certainly haven't heard the last scandal from that industry. I mean, aside from all the issues of privacy and, power over private citizens and so on and so forth. So I think it's actually, maybe it doesn't seem that way at first, but I think it's actually quite a relevant topic.
So it's touching not only on a matter of what's fair, but on a matter of our security and whose money is being spent. And ultimately, it's our money, our money that we pay in taxes that's being used in these ways. Whether for skewed agriculture policies that favor certain types of foods or sectors, or for security. So we are...
Can I just say something about agriculture?
Sorry.
I think
Yes.
Just very briefly on agriculture, because I appreciate we are, in some sense of the word, out of time. It's clearly a key issue. In the book, we do show, in particular, for example, in relation to Italy, that 16% of agricultural GDP is passing through the informal sector, which is a polite way of saying is controlled by local, in inverted commas, mafia groups. So the agro-mafia in Italy is well established, and actually it's a major issue. And we also refer to the fact that in France, the National Farmers Union, or its equivalent, appealed to the president about 3 years ago to say they hoped he realized that at the level of counterfeiting in French agricultural reporting systems was so high that it was no longer to be relied upon. I think I would just say in relation to, I don't want to comment on sugar because I'm not very well informed on that, but I know something about cotton. And it's fair to say that the very generous subsidies given to U.S. cotton farmers under the Farm Bill are, in one sense, excessive and certainly impinge very directly on the opportunities facing African producers of cotton, who are all small-scale farmers, an area that I've worked in myself. But whether or not that is a form of corruption, then that's debatable. So, Shasta, I'm just going to end on a more light-hearted note, but in relation to this question. I can safely report on this very point that it wasn't so long ago, I think possibly 3 years, that I was here in Washington, read the New York Times, which said that in a small town in Yorkshire in the north of England called Todmorden, it is reported that a certain abattoir is selling horse meat which should be lamb. And I found it quite extraordinary that I had to come to Washington to realize that my neighbor on a hillside on a moor in Yorkshire was actually selling horse meat instead of lamb. So I was very flattered that my hometown, which is a very small place, was in the New York Times, but not so pleased that it was for such a nefarious purpose.
Thank you, Laurence. We're about to wrap up. Would Yana or Christian, do you have any final thoughts before we close?
No, I think I'm good.
No? Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Laurence, and thank you, Yana. And thank you, all of you, for staying even a little bit later. I think that there's a lot of interest, and I suspect many of us would want to, if we had the time, to go out and have a coffee or something stronger and continue the discussion.
Great.
Hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
You gave us a very interesting account. I was fascinated by that.
Huh?
I was fascinated by Yana's description of all of that.
Oh,
You get down in the trenches, don't you?
Congressional processes.
Yes.
oh yeah.
It's amazing.
Too much info, more than I need.
It's very good.
Thank you.
That's very important. Please do. Carry on the good work. Right. Anyway.
Absolutely. Maybe there are a couple of